There's a common expression amongst the liberty-minded which goes that freedom isn't free. This is true, though somehow it has seemingly eluded their understanding that this slogan is equally applicable to their much-beloved free market. So while they cling to their God and their guns, both of which I fully support their right to do, they've gone and allowed their economy, and by near extension their society, to be incrementally mined out from under their very feet and those of future generations by allowing it to fall into the clutches of a cabal of ruthless parasitic clowns who view the whole world as their personal walled garden, and who thus wise view its inhabitants as problematic crops to be kempt and harvested, and anyone who does not and or cannot serve the gardener's vision will be designated a weed in need of pruning. I want to quickly preface this video by saying that I'm not trying to draw a false equivalence between capitalism and communism. I understand perfectly well why the latter never performs as advertised. But having said that, I also stand by my assertion that capitalism, which is to say the free market exchange of economic capital, while by far the superior economic system in principle, is also not a sufficient model to run a whole society on in and of itself. To understand what I mean by this, we need to first understand the primary conceptual drive motor compelling all forms of human cooperation, mutualistic dependence or codependence for short. I've made a whole other video on that topic, so I'll link it below if you want to know more. But for now, simply know that both capitalism and communism have an economic and social component. As well they must, since an economy doesn't exist without a society, which in turn is nothing more than a collaborative pool of many interdependent communities. But as I've said before, the point of failure for both communism and capitalism is when the delicate interdependence net of society is broken, such as, say, by a revolutionary new model of economic production which changes the individual from a necessary organelle in the community matrix to an interchangeable cog in an impersonal industrial mechanism. And as I've also previously stated, capitalism is just economic Darwinism, and feudalism, functionally, is just prenatal fascism. Now, with all that on the table, consider why it is that humans are social animals in the first place. Why do we form tribal communities? What drove our evolutionary ancestors down that road? What evolutionary benefit was there to being part of a group who would stand by you in hard times and who would uplift you when you were weak? Once you have your answer, consider under that same light the Marxist maxim, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Then finally ask yourself, what point is there in investing yourself in a collective that will just leave you out in the cold the moment you become inconvenient? When you can answer that question honestly, you'll begin to have a new understanding for why there is still such sweeping sentimental support for a utopian pipe dream, which has not only provably failed on every executional occasion, but has also in that same process caused more death and destruction than every other bad idea of the same century combined. The limitation of capitalism, as opposed to a failure as it is a feature, not a bug, is that it is primarily an economic model, whereas communism, which I believe at least started out as an instinctive principle rejection of the intrinsically antisocial industrial paradigm, is primarily a social one. The problem inherent to trying to employ either system on its own is that they invariably accentuate the worst aspects of each of the formerly united settings, feeding into the small-minded prejudicial superstitions of the isolated tribal village as well as the technocratic barbarity of the atomized urban center, making it so that they no longer need to so much as feign a reciprocal relationship with those they now effectively not only rule, but own. I.e., the same competition which makes evolution of any sort work is also, by that same coin, antithetical to a cooperative community. Unless, of course, the competition exists for a reason outside of merely winning the game, of beating a non-existent high score, of accumulating wealth purely for the sake of masturbating one's own ego. This is what, according to the same conservative muppets who'll merrily preach about the sanctity of corporate profits when it suits them politically, it means to have a community, to have a stake in something beyond yourself, something that will survive you. But of course, though there is more of a market for that than ever, there's no money to be made in it, so good luck getting any institution to support that endeavor. Now how, you'll doubtlessly say, can I claim that the free market is responsible for such a devolution? It is because, by the same mechanisms that make both it and Darwinian evolution such effective vehicles of adaptive selection, it seeks to dissolve the reciprocal community so as to maximize the owner's short-term return on investment. If that's still not making it any clearer, consider what you would think if I told you that my purpose in life was to eat food. Now consider the proposition put forward by many of a conservative persuasion that the purpose of a business is to make money. For those who still have your doubts, which is understandable, commendable even, consider the diagram on screen. When viewed through the mutualistic lens of a community, the purpose of any business is to provide essential products or services that the ordinary individual cannot produce on their own. To do this, they need to make a profit, just as how a human body needs to take in more calories than it expends in order to function. However, when viewed from a purely economic standpoint, that is, from the perspective of the industrial capitalist, the purpose of a business is not to create value for the society, but to generate as much capital, by which is meant economic value, for its owner as possible while contributing as little as possible in exchange. This attitude puts the values of the business owner in direct and polar conflict with the customer. Rather than seeing them as fellow players of the same game, they are seen as convoluted obstacles between the owners and their profits. But, you might intelligently argue, all of what I just described is the fault of shareholder capitalism, not the free market itself. And this is true, but I ask you, did shareholder capitalism just one day magically spawn out of a hole in the ground? Whose brilliant idea was it to subtly maneuver the market's leverage away from the customer side of the formula towards that of the owners? In short, the free market itself is not the problem, but it is the seedbed from whose industrial fire spawns the real looming demons of the postmodern world. And so, by itself, it cannot be the solution. However, on the other side of the coin, just as how compulsory church attendance would not reconvert an atheist, mandatory servitude in the name of some nebulous greater good does not a proud or prosperous society make. Contrary to what the communistic shills still espouse, the simple hard and fast reality is that you cannot force people's compulsions or desires, much to the investor class's chagrin, but you can force behaviors. And if that term sounds ominously familiar to you, then here is where we come to the biggest thorn pressing into the side of the Western world at present. For those who've somehow not encountered the term ESG, or environmental social governance, before, the TLDR, it is a top-down bureaucratic initiative whose publicly facing goal is to address the long-standing legitimate grievance with shareholder capitalism, which is its prioritization of short-term investor profits at the total expense of long-term sustainability, both for the company and for society at large. But, as should be abundantly clear to those who've been keeping even vague track of the culture war's most recent fronts, this corporate governance initiative, just as with all others, is not and has never been anything more than a shallow elitist charade meant to trick us into transferring even more wealth and power to the upper classes. And unfortunately, it's worked, perhaps too well for the damage to ever be reversed within any of our lifetimes. This, ironically enough, falls directly in line with how Friedrich Engels originally differentiated communism from socialism in the preface to the Communist Manifesto. To quote, "By socialism in 1847 was understood the most multifarious social quacks who, by all manners of tinkering, profess to redress, without any danger to capital or profit, all sorts of social grievances." Sound familiar? If so, then you're starting to grasp the massive catch-22 we are caught in right now. On the one hand, industrial shareholder capitalism has created a system exclusively focused on maximizing nearsighted economic gains to the absolute exclusion of everything else that makes a society even worth having for the average person. While on the other, the same idealistic cabal of inordinately stupid despots have conjured a final solution in which we will all own nothing and be happy. How do they imagine this will come to pass? Why, by their socially mutating the entire human race into a protozoic species of amorphous, androgynous, servile, eusocial worker drones, of course. Freeing their democracy of all dissenters, liberating their markets of all inefficiencies, purging their society of all impurities. Does any of that ring any historical bells for you? It should. You want to know my real, unambiguous thoughts on all this? I'll tell you. Diamonds are simple, but stagnant. Gold is pure and utterly useless for any craft outside of earning the temporary fealty of other simpletons. Power doesn't corrupt, it enables. The devil doesn't give commands, he gives permission. If any or all of that sounds depressingly familiar to you, then all I have to say is, hello. Welcome to the real world. Now the real question is, what should we do? I won't pretend to have an answer. As a wise man once said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. I guess we'll all need to decide how much tyranny we're prepared to live with. or how much of ourselves we're prepared to live without. Until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and stay vigilant. Peace.